Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to everybody who has joined us today on The Exchange. This is a new online platform brought to you by the Stephen Lawrence Research Centre, which is based at Montfort University in Leicester. I am Sherilyn Pereira. I'm the Public Engagement Manager for the Stephen Lawrence Research Centre. As your invitation has outlined already, we're aiming to take this conversation to a whole new level with The Exchange, where we'll be utilising cutting-edge research to help drive conversation, exchange ideas, and raise awareness of issues that are not necessarily always covered in the public arena and through academic research, areas around race, racism, and social justice. And we'll be sharing our perspectives and just giving a platform for a voice for those sort of issues to be heard more widely. This is our second in the Exchange webinar series, Education in the Time of Corona. The coronavirus pandemic has created an educational crisis for secondary and higher education institutions. Pre-existing inequalities faced by racially minoritized students and staff within the sector have been deepened as a result of the pandemic, and the crisis highlights key questions for the sector. Mary Bousted, the Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union, has said that consequences of COVID-19 are going to be felt in our education system for months to come. Today, we want to explore some of the challenges that exist for racially minoritized educators and students and look at whether or not any of those have been resolved. We also want to look at what lessons have been learned so far and what from those experiences can we take into the new academic year to inspire success for all. We're hoping to decipher some of the guidance issued by the government and to help reimagine models of educational success. Joining us today, we have an expert panel of educators who will be addressing some of the specific areas of concern. Camille London-miyo, MBE, is a Midlands senior school leader. She's past president of the Leicester National Education Union and also a member of the Black Educators Alliance. Camille will be speaking about institutional racism and experience of Black educators during this pandemic, as well as the redesign of the school's curriculum to better serve all students. Riaz Laher is the executive head of Madani Schools Federation, a Leicester-based faith school. As a head teacher, Riaz will be sharing his perspectives on how he is preparing and encouraging staff to excel in an environment going forward. Site-based teaching is going to look very different, and he'll be sharing some of his plans to counter the negative effect of coronavirus to achieve bright outcomes for young people from a BAME background. Robert Howell is head of the Religious Studies Department at Judge Meadow Community College. With GCSE exams being replaced by a predictive grading process due to corona, Robert is primarily concerned with outcomes for Year 10 students who would have been sitting their GCSE exams this summer. And he'll be looking at how the pandemic has affected and continues to affect their learning and progression experience. Julie Walters-Nisbett is a transition coordinator at the City of Leicester College. She's also vice president of the Leicester National Education Union. She's the former chair of the Black Teachers Network here in Leicester. Julie will be speaking about the impact coronavirus has had on A-levels and the longer-term impact for those aspiring to continue onto higher education. She'll be looking at some of these inequalities and outcomes for those students. I'd also like to introduce Kaushika Patel. She is the interim Pro-Vice Chancellor and interim Dean of Health and Life Sciences at De Montfort University. Kaushika will explore the conversations that the university is having, and also within the wider sector, around making sure that these inequalities are not exacerbated for students who wish to enter higher education. Camille, I'd like to start with you. perhaps you can give us a perspective on the current situation, actually pre-COVID, and how some of those inequalities have been extended even more due to the coronavirus pandemic.
Okay, good afternoon, Sherilyn. Thank you for inviting me. My central premise is that nothing much has changed in the last 30 years. When the Macpherson report was published over 30 years ago, in response to the murder of Stephen Lawrence, institutional racism was defined as the collective failure of an organisation to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their colour, culture or ethnic origin, and that it could be seen or detected in processes, attitudes and behaviour which amount to discrimination through unwitting, prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness and racist stereotyping, which disadvantage minority ethnic people. It persists because of the failure of the organisation to openly and adequately recognise and address its existence and causes by policy, example and leadership. So, without recognition and action to eliminate such racism, it can prevail as part of the ethos or culture of the organisation. And Macpherson said that institutional racism was a corrosive disease. So when we look at education, who holds the power in terms of policy? It's our government, it's the DfE, it's our education policymakers, our academics, our teacher training bodies, and our unions. And that all of these bodies need to openly accept that institutional racism exists within education. Now, if all of these bodies accepted it existed, you would expect that they would aim to right the wrongs or level up the imbalances in order to create a fair and just society. Some might argue as to how this could be done. Well, we only have to look at what the police force was supposed to have done. They were supposed to have a zero tolerance for racism. And within 2 years after the Macpherson report, there was the introduction of detailed targets for the recruitment, retention and promotion of Black and Asian officers. So even if we use that as our basic standard, as we shine a spotlight on education in the United Kingdom. So if we look at recruitment and retention, the recruitment, retention and promotion targets for Black teachers, I've been in the profession for over 30 years and I've never seen it. I've seen attempts at it happening, but they're always short-lived. So does that mean that the teaching profession that exists truly reflects the diverse population that it needs to serve? Well, Patrick Roach, the first Black General Secretary of the second largest union in one of his inaugural speeches, said that growing up in the UK in the 1970s, he could categorically state that as far as racism was concerned, nothing had changed. And there is a growing body of research that tells us that there are not enough Black teachers in the profession. Those that are still in the profession are finding that they tend to not only be lower paid, but according to surveys, more likely to be subject to disciplinary and capability procedures. And let's face facts. We have known since the 1970s about the institutional racism that exists in the British education system. Bernard Cord's book lays testament to that. Cord's thesis was that African Caribbean children were disproportionately failing in mainstream schooling because of the school system itself. Roll on nearly 50 years later, and the Leicester City Council Underachievement of Black Caribbean Pupils report, published in 2018, noted that Black Caribbean pupils still continue to underachieve in the strong GCSEs in English and Maths. The figure in 2018 was a pass for Black Caribbean of 20%, as compared with 42% nationally. That's an important point. There is a gap of nearly 50 years, but both reports are saying more or less the same thing. And if we look at it from a more subjective perspective, 4 generations of my family live in this city, and it would suggest that I would have been affected by institutional racism, my children and my grandchildren? How many other Black families can recount their own stories of racism, discrimination, and the patterns that they've faced within the education system? We only have to look at exclusion figures and the patterns of discriminatory practice in the education of young Black boys to actually see how institutional racism in education is rife. Again, there are countless reports about the effects of a monocultural empirical education system that only seeks to maintain the power dynamic in the hands of the majority white society. So what needs to change? Well, at its core, initial teacher training needs to ensure that it positively recruits Black NQTs to promote a more diverse workforce. The programs of study for initial teacher training need to have anti-racist teaching practices as the core fundamental basis of its delivery. And these programs of study for initial teacher training need to be led more often by Black experienced teachers to deliver these anti-racist programs. In schools, primary and secondary, or sixth form colleges need to reflect the communities they seek to serve at all levels of the leadership spine. Schools should complete yearly quality data audits that are easily available to show who they employ, where they are employed, and what positions they're employed at. COVID-19 has shone an even brighter light on the failures of this education system. Black teachers identified as being at risk have been bullied into going into school on rotas, returning to school in spite of government and union guidance to the contrary. Some of them, one thing has been clear, that even though we know that Black people are at risk of contracting COVID, it does not seem to have affected the way some senior leadership teams have used risk assessments as a stick to beat Black staff back into school. Some leadership teams have decided to complete individual risk assessments and in the end tell staff to return to school or reevaluate their position. That's code for find another job. We cannot ignore the whole tomb of experiences that Black teachers in the UK have faced. Bullying, racist stereotyping, stopped from getting further training or promotion, accounts where white staff get paid time off to complete further education and higher education courses, while Black staff are told that nothing of that sort exists. Times where Black staff are given the most challenging classes with no support, while their white colleagues teach a class of 10 or 15 students with the support staff. We don't have time to list all the discriminatory practices that Black teachers face. So what do? It is not just about having more Black head teachers, because being the sole Black leader in an all-white leadership team is no less restrictive than being that one Black teacher in a faculty. It is about changing the culture of leadership, educational leadership in this country. What does an education leader look like today in 2020? Go to a head teachers conference and you will see. It is about changing a curriculum that has been erected to maintain the status quo. Back in 1986, John Eggleston wrote about education for some. Now, over 30 years later, we are talking about an education system that is built for the few at the expense of the most disadvantaged groups in our society. How can it be that even now, as we approach the 6-week summer break, we know as Black teachers that there are many Black children and young people who have become even more disaffected, even more disengaged with a curriculum that was not built for them? History tells us what disaffected, disengagement, and no provision can lead to. We know of Black teachers who are dreading returning, like most teachers, to school, but they have the added fear of contracting COVID. Why? Because right now we know of schools being closed because of COVID, but it's simply not been reported in the news because it does not fit the government narrative. So institutional racism in education still exists in 2020. The powers that be need to act, not talk. They need to act, not throw money to their friends to conduct an inquiry that we already know the answer to before the ink is dry. We know black teachers are likely to face an even harsher backlash in terms of recruitment, retention, and progression post-lockdown. Nobody at present is there to protect them, to ensure that this does not happen. The public sector duty on equality does not apply to schools, and our numerous academy chains are the mavericks in the mix, doing what they like in their own little islands. Our teaching unions also have to look in at themselves. We cannot be the change we seek if the boardrooms of power do not reflect the communities they aim to serve. If we truly believe post-lockdown and later post-COVID that Black lives do matter, that institutional racism is a disease that needs to be destroyed, then we need to walk the talk, not simply talk. We are the change that we've been looking for. Thank you.
Thank you, Camille. That was quite enlightening and certainly set the tone for the rest of the webinar, but also gave us some really useful insights into how institutional racism is still very much alive, especially for staff who aren't contemplating a return to site-based teaching. I'd like to invite Riaz now to share his perspective from a leadership point of view on what he feels the government guidance is providing or not providing for schools.
Thank you, Sharon, and good evening, panel, and of course everyone listening in. So I've been asked to provide some leadership perspective within education at the time of Corona for what has been quite a few months of confusion and ambiguities. So I'll be making reference to the government guidelines, decisions that we've made and conversations that we've had. And then lastly, how do we long-term counter the negative impact and effects of the pandemic? So to start off with, as most people would be aware, in terms of daily updates that are released by what seems to be daily updates and has been throughout by the UK government and the Department for Education on all matters related to provision for schools, there's been very little reference to BAME. In fact, absolutely none that I've really come across that's been detailed enough to given the magnitude of the issue. Moreover, many organisations, both statutory and non-statutory, have been releasing numerous guidance and documents. And I'll be honest, in terms of leadership teams and staff in general, I've been suffering information overload and update fatigue for many, many months now. So conversations at most levels about planning or risk assessment has been on the assumption that all staff and all stakeholders are BAME, but these can only really be consulted upon when the guidance has been meticulously and thoughtfully scrutinized to ascertain if there is and to what extent any realistic prospect of returning to school by the end of the school year. I'll be very honest, in terms of our schools and our two schools, I do not now, and I have not done throughout at any point, envisaged a reopening of the schools, staggered or otherwise, and particularly not until all of the guidance currently being drip fed and there's more coming through all the time has been released and carefully examined. And even upon examination and scrutiny, I've not been convinced, and nor has my leadership team or board. For us, it's really been about basic metrics. We're very mindful of our demographics as our schools and the context of our school, the vast majority being up to 4 times more vulnerable to the virus. I don't say this in any reference to any guidance, though generally I have preferred independent guidance because it generally doesn't have economic bias, but guided by my accountability as a head teacher towards all of my stakeholders. So we haven't opened We've been generally out of sync with most schools. We've had students in for one-to-one, but we've, and I hate to use the government term, ramped up other aspects of our work, which I will come to later. So the mantra has been for us in terms of understanding the guidance is really looking at it through the prism of the vulnerabilities of our teams. So the mantra to staff has been, if it can be done safely, it will, but if it cannot be done, it won't be done, and we haven't. We will always do what we agree is right and safe for our school staff and stakeholders. So this is not about doing less, this is about doing things differently. And that's generally been our approach. So in saying that, we have taken very seriously our critical role in maintaining the routines and learning of our students, and crucially resisting their urge to socialize with friends during the school day. So we've been mindful of that. So we needed to find a balance. So far, feedback has been generally that our students are getting far more consistent provision of learning and support, albeit very, very different. This takes me to the next section in terms of how have we throughout, and how do we in the long term aim to counter the negative impacts of the pandemic. So the starting point is, and I think we all agree, is that existing systematic challenges and problems are at the heart of the attainment gap anyway, even pre-coronavirus. The ongoing pandemic lockdown has only exposed these inequalities in our societies. So before we move forward, we've got to acknowledge as a starting point that the lockdown has only further disadvantaged, exacerbated the conditions and issues at hand. This is simply not up for debate. So challenges include, let's state the most obvious. BAME groups across the Western world have been profoundly affected and more affected by the virus, especially those working in critical roles. Because of living in shared households and with people of different ages, particularly the elderly and the more vulnerable and more susceptible to the impact of the virus. So bereavement, illness, mental health. Generally, most BME students live in more deprived areas. So there's the affluence impact. This then results into issues with spaces to learn at home, overcrowded households with multiple generation occupants, technology issues, resources to learn at home, support for learning at home, particularly with EAL families. We found so many parents where we've had to support the entire family household because of the confusion with what is a recurring theme of ambiguity in a lot of the guidance. And I'm not just talking education guidance. So affluency generally, I found, and I can say that from the benefit of being a professional and a head teacher, that whilst it enables some of us to benefit, it inhibits others, and it further disadvantages. And we're seeing that with our families. And I'd like to think we're a school who are really proactive in narrowing and diminishing disadvantage from our groups, from the rest of society. But we can see that at first hand from the feedback that we are getting from our students. So what are some of the small steps that we have taken? We've not tried to change the world, but what we've really longed to do is to make the small wins count and consolidate them and take them into the future, because I think the new normal will be some sort of hybrid of blended learning, which is the term that is being used. So if the gap is apparent in normal times, it can only widen now. So engagement has been positive for us. However, nationally, we fear, and I fear, that the gap will only widen further. So we have really focused on mentoring, on one-to-one. Any students who have come in has been on a one-to-one basis. We're one of the only schools that have had year sixes in a very, very careful and moderated and mitigated way. But we really wanted to acclimatize those students, forget 4 meters, almost 4 meters apart, but in small clusters, to meet me as a head teacher, so I can say, look, I can't welcome you now fully and show you around the school. I can only show you this limited area outside the school. This is your school, and you will hopefully have the best and happiest years of your life here, because I don't want them to have that anxiety and concerns over the holiday period. So engagement with them and with all of our students has been really important. Regular calls. I don't just mean catch-up calls or drop-ins. Meaningful conversations with tutors and with staff and with senior leaders and with parents too. really breaking down some of the guidance for our parents. Not too difficult. We know from Parents' Evening which parents normally struggle and have language barriers. So really breaking down, if they understand what the rules are and what the barriers are and what the limitations are during lockdown, so they don't make mistakes and they don't expose themselves to their own vulnerabilities in society during lockdown, giving them guidance with their employers in terms of whether they should be going to work, and really breaking down, disseminating some of the information as a broader role as a school and as a duty for our schools. In terms of investment, I've made a significant investment. I think generally, across the grain of what I generally have seen in other schools. So we're investing in, we normally have 3 sets. We're going to 4 and 5 sets with some of the smaller class sizes we've ever seen. And we've generally always had really small class sizes. So really investing in addressing those deficits that we undoubtedly will see when students return, because they need to be given a stepping stone to the future. And that applies for all students, but particularly our students who largely come from a diverse background, but deprived backgrounds as well. So a significant investment also in intervention. So the last 3 months has been a massive acclimatization process for staff and students, an investment in training for staff to really understand the intricacies of this new world of technology. So it's been new times, but it's been interesting. But it's certain areas we want to hold on to. In terms of hybrid learning and blended learning, which seem to be the new themes, we've really been thinking about which parts of the curriculum do pupils really need to experience in school or college with a teacher, and which parts they can practice and consolidate at home. Making sure, of course, like Camille mentioned, how our curriculum, communication, processes, systems of teaching are even more inclusive to our students and to our families. We're not just talking about languages. This is actual structural changes that we can make that, as Camille alluded to, structurally, systematically, we find across the education sector isn't always there. And once we're doing it in a microcosm of our school, it's something that we need to look outwards towards all schools across the sector to do better. So we've been proactive in supporting all students to access laptops and materials that they need for learning, in crowded families with restricted space and restricted devices. So food parcels, well before the government was able to provide the vouchers, we invested when it was difficult to go to the shops, we invested in a significant amount of key ingredients that we were providing parcels to not only students, but also to staff, so they can, without fear, make a collection without queuing up for shops. And I'm talking at the height of the pandemic. And of course, the pandemic is still here. While society seems like it's going back to some normality, it isn't in reality. This pandemic isn't over. So in general, as a summary in terms of the last aspect, this is a time for reflection. It's been a reflection time for me and my leadership team, a time to rethink how we do things, but it's also an opportunity as well, a time for transformation, when we can reassess our lives and reprioritize, as so many have been doing in our own lives, discovering what is fair or just, and I'm almost finished, what is important and what is not. In our school tradition, we always ask ourselves, where then are you going? So it's a big question, and one that I've challenged my staff with. It's a question we have to ask ourselves as individuals, as leaders, as teachers, and as society. Yes, we are in a crisis, but for too long, many of us have had misguided priorities, too often about ourselves, and sometimes forgetting the rest of humanity, and actually using the opportunity to create solidarity that is required. The recent Black Lives Matters rising after the sad murder of George Floyd Jr. and so many others before shouldn't be wasted, shouldn't be forgotten, and not a day more, because it's only when we start to look for the common good and work together, both in our context as a school and beyond, can we prevail. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Riaz. Very enlightening. Robert, I know that as a Year 10 teacher, you are particularly concerned with outcomes for your year group who are currently or would have been taking their GCSE exams this summer. And those exams have now been replaced by predictive grading. So inequalities, we know, were always there. But how has the current pandemic, do you think, in your opinion, affected those who are already faced with inequalities?
All right, thank you very much, Sharon, and hi to everybody out there. It's not just the year 10s, because the year 10s are really due to take their exams in 2021. It's the year 11s who were supposedly taking their exams this year. So now would be the time they're doing their exams, and well, they're finished by now. It's a fundamental problem with predicted grades, and predicted grades is a bit of a paradox as well, because the problem with predicted grades is that they're seen as unreliable. Predicted grades come from the teacher, and the teacher is in a position whereby they're able to understand and have the experience of being with that student over a period of time to then make a decision how they believe they're going to perform in an exam. But then the government has often said, well, teachers' predictions do follow a sense of bias, and I'll come to that bias a little bit later. But now we find ourselves in deep within the pandemic and with regards to COVID-19, and making it very clear that exams had to be scrapped, and they had to be scrapped because of the social distancing. So it's all understandable, and no one was in any misunderstanding of the situation. But then the responsibility to a great degree was left in the hands of the classroom teacher, as in the government, along with the exam boards, made the decision that it would be the predicted grades that would be the deciding factor on how the student would have performed. And leaving that in the hands of the classroom teacher now begs the question, well, previously it was considered that was a flaw and it was inaccurate. And they would say probably 16% of teacher predictions were actually accurate. But now we're using that as the main guiding line as into how students would have performed in the real exam. So there's our first problem there, because how do we then shift from it being unreliable to it being a sense of reliability? And at first you would have had students who first heard that news in the media to say, well, they would have been celebrating and throwing their hands in the air thinking, fantastic, I don't have to do any revision. Nothing is a problem now, because, you know, that's taken out of my hands. And what we're now faced with is a situation where the teacher will decide how I've done, so I'm fine. I don't have to worry about revision. That soon failed in significance, because they began to realize that, okay, so now the teacher's going to make that decision, and teachers intentionally or unintentionally carry a bias, and that bias is very often based on classroom behavior, students' attitude to learning, and obviously past history of how the student has performed in assessments within the classroom, mock exams as well. So these are the kind of things that the teachers are having to work with, and then the reality then hits the student that perhaps it's not going to be as reliable, it's not going to be as fair as they thought it would have done, because as we know, historically students don't take as seriously mock exams as they would do the real exam, because the real exams, as it says, is real. Mock exams are a trial. So they very often don't put the same amount of effort into performing as they would do in the real exam. But then the teachers need some sort of data to go by to then make a decision as into how well they think the student would do in reality. So that's what the teacher would be using as one of their variables to come to a final conclusion. But then again, that falls in line with the unreliability of the whole process. But none of us are ignorant to the fact that, as was banded at the early stages, unprecedented times call for unprecedented action. So then we would say, well, what else could the examination boards do? What else could the government do? Because there was no clear decision or idea of when was actually going to come out of this pandemic, and so then allow the students to actually sit their exams. That's the problem. And it's still a problem because the government, as Rhea has alluded to, is constantly changing or adjusting the original ideas. It's fluid, and we know it's fluid because we are struggling to follow the thoughts and processes and the logic behind some of the actions that the government is taking. And schools are only receiving information at very random stages, so they're not always ahead of the game. They're receiving information very often when they're hearing it on the daily update, and then they need to then make a decision how they're going to run the school, which isn't really a practical way of doing things. So there's another problem that we have to deal with there, is how we're receiving the information from the government. So these factors are all falling in line and piling up to the difficulties and the challenging of the validity of predicted grades. And then we come to another aspect, and the aspect of predicted grades and the bias of teachers, which I mentioned before, becomes a problem when that bias becomes an unconscious bias. Because we know historically that students of the Black minority ethnic, the pattern that they fall into, and the section that they fall into, they're very often disadvantaged by predicted grades. They very often do well in the final exams compared to their white counterparts. Now, there's a multitude of reasons behind this, but we're focused on predicted grades for now. And the issue with predicted grades is that very often the subject teacher has a perception of the students, whether be it for a number of reasons, such as one, the color of their skin, two, the socioeconomic status. They're the two main factors that have an unconscious factor that leads to the decision-making process of the classroom teacher. But behavior is also a thing as well, which I'll again address it later on while I'm speaking. But that's a big problem, because students of Black and ethnic minorities, they would say that teachers are underestimating and underpredicting how they think they are going to perform in the real exam. That has a massive knock-on effect, and especially during the time of COVID, where that's what we're totally relying on. If they're underpredicting how the student is going to perform in these exams, that is what's really going to be the deciding factor of what happens next in their educational journey. The year 11 students are totally reliant on these grades to then move on to college or onto apprenticeships in order to progress in life. And if they're starting at a disadvantage because of the predicted grade, well, then they're going to be forever playing catch up or having to work, as parents of BAME students would say, twice or three times harder to catch up with their white counterparts. Now, clearly we can see that is an unfair position to be in. This unfair position to be in isn't just because of the teacher bias. The unfair position is linked to socio-economic status. We know this. Lack of funds to have access to online equipment, as Rhea has mentioned earlier on. This is also going to be a problem, because during the time of COVID, many schools have gone to online teaching. Now, it's a very difficult process to go through, teachers having to set their work and monitor work and make sure students are doing it as well. But if you are struggling to get access or even have in your possession the technology to get onto the internet, well, then you're going to be at a disadvantage, because the luxury of being on the internet is that the teacher can then see your work, mark your work, and feedback to you how well you're doing. If everything you're doing is a hard copy, therefore on paper, you are then going to struggle because you don't have that feedback. So that link and that connection is broken. So progress is very difficult to attain consistently without the feedback from the professional who has set the work in the first place. So these are problems. But if we go back to the predicted grade, these problems then become more difficult to challenge when the students feel that the member of staff who has been their teacher for however long that period is having these preconceived ideas. Now, where these preconceived ideas come from? Now, it's a continuous thing. If we go back to almost London-miyo was saying, is perhaps tapping into this sense of institutionalized racism. That could be a factor. You know, it's not a conclusive decision to say that's what it is. But as time goes by, if you're looking at a student and you're thinking, well, you are going to underachieve because that's what historically happens, well, then that is a disadvantage for that student. And they see this. And the predicted grades becomes an even more important factor when we're talking about how the government and the examination boards are going to look at the data. Because the data is looked at in a way where they're looking at how the previous cohort did. Now, previous cohorts in a school that is in an affluent area, so therefore the parents and the kids are already conditioned to behave in a way that's seen as, you know, the ideal student or the role model student, or the parents have the funds to include extra tuition outside of school. Well, that cohort tends to be consistent across the board. And so the examination board will see that, well, they're fitting in line with normality, and so therefore they will continue to have those high grades. The predicted grades will stay high because they're consistent. This is a problem for schools in the lower economic status areas, whereby poverty is a major contributor to their access to education. However, the student who is in an impoverished environment whereby they have several people living in a household, and those people therefore are infringing on the academic and the educational environment of that student, well, then there's an automatic perception that, well, they're not going to do very well because they aren't very rich, or their culture and community would suggest that they don't value education. So with all these factors in place, then the examination board and the government make the decision that, well, we don't think that these students are going to achieve these sort of grades, and so therefore we're going to bring down their grades based on previous cohorts. So it's difficult to look into individual successes, because the predicted grades and the previous cohorts is all tied into the same output that the calculations are going to make, and the decision we made. Is that a reliable way of working out how the predicted grade is going to be accurate? Not really. But what are the answers to this problem? Now, as I mentioned behavior earlier on, so we don't want to fall into the line whereby there's an excuse for everything, every reason why a person of color or in a socioeconomic state that is low is not going to do well. It isn't a guarantee. It isn't a given that someone who is of the BAME community or low socioeconomic status is automatically going to do well, or it is because of the color of their skin or their financial situations doesn't dictate how they're going to be. So then people in the teaching profession have a perception again, well, then your behavior is dictating how you are. We aren't blameless. There are times whereby students are behaving in a way whereby it isn't conducive with the learning. It may impact on other people's learning. So therefore, we're building up our own perceptions based on certain behaviors. So there is a sense of personal responsibility that individuals need to take on board. But if you already have in this concept that a person of color is already going to be a misbehavior, well, then that person is the self-fulfilling prophecy that we already are familiar with. That student thinks, well, you have a negative impression of me. All I'm going to do is just fulfill that impression. It's a lot more difficult for a child to break away from that impression and show the individual that they actually are going to achieve. The adult already has a perception, whether it's biased, whether it's conscious or unconscious, they go with that. And then that becomes the deciding factor of how the student is going to perform. That's where it becomes a problem. And it's breaking that perception and breaking that idea, which is what's going to be a challenge. Now, there are many things that people come up with and say, you know, we decolonize, colonialize the curriculum. That's one of the things that people have said. And they're saying if there's more access and more, if students are exposed to things that reflect them as an individual, they're more likely to succeed. That's an argument that still remains to be seen whether it carries weight and validity or not. Because there's still a sense whereby they need to learn things that are different to themselves as well. That helps them to engage in the society. To have things that only reflect who they are, or to only have things that reflect the negative side of things. We've constantly pointing out that the students are failing because there's a bias, there's a constant bias. Well, then that gives the student that free ticket to say, well, there's no wonder I'm not going to achieve because there's a bias against me already. It may then impact on whether they're actually going to have the staying power and the resilience to actually say, you know what, it doesn't matter what they think about me, I'm actually going to prove them wrong. But the predicted grade doesn't give that opportunity. The predicted grade doesn't allow the individual to prove this teacher's wrong. The predicted grade doesn't give that chance to say that irrespective of my circumstances, irrespective of my skin color, I can still achieve. And this is what's going to be the problem. Then the problems are then a knock-on effect of what happens next with the year 10s and the year after in 2021, because we're not sure how it's going to work and everything is unsure. But one thing is most certain is that if you are a person of color, you are a person of color. There's no denying that. There's no escaping that. There is a sense of individual responsibility, but we need to ensure that we are moving towards the same sort of things that Ms. London-Miyo was talking about and Riaz was talking about, this idea of changing the mindset and changing the culture to ensure that there's a more clearer sense of equality and a level playing field with also a sense of personal responsibility. So I'll leave you with that thought there, is that it's not solely about what people think, and they don't make that the final decision on how the outcome is going to be in everyday life. In this situation, it is, because it's a predicted grade. And if that predicted grade is based on a bias, well, then that puts those people on the negative side of the bias at an automatic disadvantage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. That was definitely insightful. I particularly enjoyed, the conversation you had around students at first thinking that they had got off lightly, but actually then realizing the impact of predicted grading on their futures. That was particularly insightful. I'd like to invite Julie now, Julie Walters-Nisbett, to talk about again the effects of these inequalities on A-level students, and how perhaps we might be able to combat some of those inequalities, if you can, Julie.
Sure, thank you, Sharon. And good afternoon to everyone. The sound's a little bit different. We are looking at A-levels. So like Robert said, in the beginning of April, the government announced that A-levels and GCSEs weren't going to sit their exams, that in fact they would be based on teacher-based predicted grades. Now, the history of UCAS, which is the organisation that deals with applying to university, is that students were always given predicted grades by their teachers, okay? These predicted grades would have had to have been on their UCAS form for January 2020 for anybody that was applying to university to start in September this year. Having done some research around Black students and entry into university, I was quite surprised that back in 2016, 8% of undergraduates were actually Black students. There was lots in the press about getting into Oxford and Cambridge, Oxbridge together, and they were challenged by David Lammy, in particular Oxford, to try and increase those numbers. Cambridge then went on to have what's called the Stormzy effect, where Stormzy, the grime artist, actually sponsored some students going to Cambridge. And in October 2019, Cambridge declared that they now had 200 Black students as undergraduates in university. This left the other Russell Group universities, which I talked about quite in depth in Slaying Your Lane, which I read recently, about our young people and accessing these top universities. So as I said, by January 2020, UCAS grades should have already been in the system for most Year 13 students. UCAS has got very extensive guidance on their website, so if anybody'd like to have a look, about how those predicted grades should be put together. It should take into account the best interests of the students, aspirational but achievable. These are all on the UCAS website. But yet, it was very well known that most students, and particularly Black students, actually often achieved those grades above their predictions. And Robert's already talked about bias, yes, and that yes, there could be bias. And in talking to some ex-A-level students over the last week, they've actually said, yes, the bias could work two ways. Some people who had great interpersonal relationships with their teachers were often over-predicting, and those who didn't have that developed relationship with their students, and, let's be honest, Camille's already talked about the underrepresentation of Black teachers and Black teachers in leadership, were under-predicted. The BBC themselves in April got some students in who were successful at Oxbridge, and some of those were underpredicted, not just one but on average, but sometimes 2 grades under what they were actually capable of achieving. So from March, April, May, our students were at home with the barriers Riaz talked about, lack of internet, shared ICT provision. What we found is that the older students tended to be the students who got access to the computers last. I could see from the times that they were sending work in that the students, the younger students, the primary siblings in the house were being given the laptops first. Not every child has their own room. And in fact, the Sutton Trust talked about the fact that the proportion of middle class students who were able to access work at home was in fact twice that from working class backgrounds back in March. Okay. So we're on to April, and teachers have been asked to do predicted grades. There were lots of conversations, professional, personal, about not making sure that student bias wasn't a factor. There were lots of internal moderations in different schools, looking to make sure that across a range of subjects, everybody was giving that student that aspirational grade, okay? That then leads us into June 2020. Just last week, it was announced that due to mass over predictions, it's expected that there's going to be a 30% decrease to the grades that many staff spent about 3 to 4 weeks predicting. Ofqual has said that if students are not happy with their predictions on results day, then they can appeal. They can choose to resit those exams that will be offered in the autumn term that they didn't have to sit this summer. But I'm going to say as well, having been a parent of an A-level student quite recently, take the time around around A-level results day, I think it's the 18th of August, to look at the courses on offer at universities through clearing, okay? I found with my own daughter last year, it's very much a buyer's market. The fact that students now have to pay for their fees means that there's a wide, vast range of courses available through clearing and through the UCAS process. Have a think about your first and second choices in preparation and lead up to that day. Speak to your teachers on the day, speak to teachers in your community if you can't access your own teachers at school. Pupils who don't feel their calculated grade actually reflects their ability, I've already said, can appeal or choose to sit the exams themselves. Camille mentioned Paul Roach earlier, and actually he said that his A-level results weren't what he expected them to be. So he went back to university and spent another year topping up those A-levels before he went on to do his undergrad and then on to do his PhD. So whilst these results may contain some bias, there are still a variety of options. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. There's some really good practical advice there for parents. I would like to introduce Kaushika to talk about that progression from A-levels into higher education. And perhaps we can come back to maybe some of the more practical advice that we can give parents during these times to help support their children through this educational journey. But Kaushika, perhaps you can share with us some of your perspectives during the pandemic. Thanks.
Certainly, thank you very much, Sherilyn. Thank you to everybody. It's been really interesting listening to all the speakers, and I'm going to touch on a little bit probably of what everybody said, but I'm going to leave some of the opportunities for questions at the end in terms of the practical things as Sherilyn has said. I think just as a point to make, it's really important to recognise that, you know, as the schools and colleges have had challenges around how they've received information from government to support them, I think that's kind of across all sectors, all disciplines. It's been challenging to look at how we return or try to return to some normality, but particularly so for the education sector. And as with schools and colleges, the university sector has had a myriad of information, mass information on a daily basis, looking at what we can and can't do or should or shouldn't do. And pre-lockdown, just before lockdown, we were looking at moving online and blended learning, and very conscious of the facts across the sector of impacts of inequalities on students, BAME students and students with socioeconomic backgrounds, which would result in them having access to IT being limited, to the networks, to broadband being limited. And therefore, how do we teach those students? How do they adjust for their learning? How do they manage with their assessments? At De Montfort University, we were one of the universities that continued with assessments, but we brought something in called the no detriment policy. Now that has its ups and downs, because the no detriment policy being primarily that no student will receive anything below what they should already have been achieving, based on the fact that they might not be able to access the right information or access the internet or have laptops or etc. like that. So across the sector, the Office for Students, which is our regulator, universities regulator, had asked universities to consider how we were going to ensure that students were not further disadvantaged. So I suppose in that respect, HE higher education was looking at how we can support our student body, the whole breadth of students. But one of the things has been said previously, we know that BAME students are further disadvantaged. In Leicester, in DMU, De Montfort University, we attract a range of students who, what we would call first generation higher education students, who would never have thought of going to university. So they're the first person in their family to go to university. Or we work really hard with our local schools and colleges to bring in students from a range of socioeconomic backgrounds, which we know that therefore they're going to have they were going to be in family groups where they may well, there may well be just one laptop or the internet connection is limited. So we've been trying to really think about how that will impact on our students through the end of this term, but also moving into the next term. Very interestingly, I think it was Camille right at the beginning was talking about risk assessments. And because we're developing the professionals of the future, we've worked quite closely with disciplines. And one of the things we've been looking at is our students going out on placements when they come back. And the health sector is one of the classics on this. They implemented a BAME risk assessment based on the overrepresentation of BAME people who were at risk and dying of COVID-19. And it was received in different ways by the BAME communities based on how it was implemented. But one of the things our staff and student body have been asking us is, how safe am I going to be coming back to university? What measures are you putting into place? So as an institution, we're trying to learn from our stakeholders, our partners in education, in the NHS, in social services. What are they doing to support their staff and their service users? And so what can we do to support our students? So some of the things that we've been looking at has very much, as a focus at De Montfort University, looked at our community, which is just over 50% BAME students. And we're really trying hard to implement some of those risk factor elements that people were talking about in terms of recognizing the higher risk of BAME students. I think we were talking about access to university, and it was Julie who was just talking about the process of getting into university, and we were talking about predicted grades. And we all know, has been said, predicted grades underpredict BAME students. And Julie just talked about going into clearing and keeping your options open. I 100% agree with that. Keep your options open, look at what's available in clearing. But something that parents may not be aware of for this year is that there is something that's been brought in that we used to have historically in higher education, which has been brought in for this 1 year because of the issues around what students' grades will look like, whether students will want to go to university next year. So if you have a child who's looking at university next year as a parent, or you as a young person are thinking about university, one of the things that you may not be aware of is the government have implemented something called the student number cap. And this, we used to have this a few years ago. Basically, it meant that universities were limited to the number of students that they could recruit in any 1 year. And they've implemented it again this year. So we all have a cap on the number of students from home, so in the UK and in Europe, that we're allowed to take. And you might think, well, okay, that's good. There's a fair share of students across the board for all universities. However, when you look at it on the basis of what will we be looking at, we'll be looking at grades. And if our BAME student communities are going to be impacted on predicted grades, and if there's going to be a review of what those predicted grades would look like, then there is definitely an impact on the number of students that will get places. Now, we need to make sure that we support our BAME student communities to access the right information. So I absolutely agree with Julie. Look really closely at what's available. De Montfort University will be supporting students looking at what's available, but Julie talked about the opportunity to appeal your grades and the opportunity to resit. those resits and the results won't come until January, when term will already have started. So what do you as a student do? And it's really important that parents and young people who are looking at university look around to see what universities are doing to offer those students who want to resit. Will they be able to start university? Will they have to take a year out? At De Montfort, we're looking at how we can support those students if they want to start and still take resits, if they want to wait and defer and take their resits and then relook at what they can do. You're allowed to remove yourself from a university offer through UCAS and reapply somewhere else. So I think that's really important. Before I finish, and I think there'll be some questions that hopefully I'll be able to support the questioners on, but I just want to comment on, we talked about the impact on the grades of students going forward. We've talked about how many students might be able to go to university. There are more BAME students applying to and getting into university now than there have been over many years. However, just as in schools and colleges, we have something called the BAME awarding gap. We have a 13% gap in the outcomes that BAME students achieve and their white counterparts achieve. And for a while, for a very long time, universities looked at that as what we called a student deficit model. And that meant that people were going, well, it's because the student's first time in higher education, it's because they didn't actually achieve very highly at school, it's because, and there was lots of it's because of the student. And the sector has woken up to ethically, morally, value-based, this isn't correct, isn't right, because we know that students who come in with a similar grade to their white counterparts, there is absolutely no reason why they shouldn't be getting the same awards going out. So the sector as a whole is looking at how, why, and how, and what can we do differently. And each university is working at a different pace. And at De Montfort, we're looking at the awarding gap, previously called the attainment gap. And I know Robert talked a little bit, he touched on decolonising, and we and whether that's kind of a fad and whether it's the right thing, and does it give people a get out clause if saying, you know, the curriculum doesn't reflect me. But looking at institutional racism, as Camille talked about right at the beginning, what De Montfort University have looked at is something called decolonising De Montfort University, not the curriculum, but the whole thing. And it's based on recognising that institutional racism is real. And if your infrastructures, if how the university is set up, who are your senior leaders, what are your academics demographics compared to your student demographics and the city you're based in? What are you teaching and how are you promoting and supporting staff and students? If you're not looking at how institutional racism impacts on all of that, and if you're not building an anti-racist university or an anti-racist education system, we further perpetuate the racism that our BAME students experience. So it's important that we support our students through this very challenging year, recognising that COVID-19 has had an impact, particularly on the well-being and mental health of our students. And therefore, how are we going to manage that and support them as they go through their education processes, either in college or at university? But also, taking it right back to what Camille talked about right at the beginning, institutional racism needs to be acknowledged and challenged, and the words used about fighting racism and building an anti-racist institution, educational institution, to make sure that our BAME students succeed. And if BAME students succeed, and if the processes and systems are as they should be, then all students will succeed, because the education process will be a much broader and much more open system. There's quite a lot more I could talk about, but I'm conscious of the fact that there will be questions, and there might be things that I've said around the no detriment policy, etc., that people might go, what does that mean? So I'm not going to carry on defining that, but I'm going to leave that open, see if there are any questions around that and see what people want to hear from me as an educator in a university. I'm going to leave it at that, Sherilyn.
Okay, thank you, Kashika. Thank you for that. For helping just to kind of clarify the pipeline for students who are moving from A levels, who are maybe considering going on into higher education, and particularly what De Montfort University has put in place, or the kind of conversations that we're having at the university to support students and to ensure that they're not going to be further exacerbated by some of these inequalities. We talked about institutional racism and decolonising, you know, all of these buzzwords at the moment. But I wanted to ask you, Camille, because I know that you're particularly involved at the moment in some work to do with curriculum redesign, and perhaps some of that work can go towards lending itself to decolonising or helping to reduce some of these inequalities. Could you just expand on that a little bit for me?
Yes, the NEU had a conference back in December entitled Decolonising the Curriculum, and I led a workshop for English teachers. And what I wanted to do was I wanted English teachers across the country to look at the curriculums that they taught and to look at how many, what I call global majority writers, how many global majority writers they were using in the teaching of English, and what did they teach successfully. So what came out of that conference was a reading list of suggested titles that Black teachers right across the UK have been using, and we've built that up over the months. And one of the key things that has been really important about that piece of work is the idea of having a resource that everybody can tap into, that we can access, and that there are books that we're all using, because I made the point that there are books that I was teaching for 15, 20 years, and the only reason why I was teaching them was because it was easier for my faculties to do those books as opposed to trying something new. And we're in a time now where we have a responsibility and a duty to ensure that we're taking on other writers, and that's part of teaching English as far as I'm concerned. So one of my pet gripes right now is that while I'm finding African writers, Caribbean writers, the amount of South Asian writers in the curriculum are slim to none. So there's definitely a lot of work to be done on that. So we've been looking at the book list, but we've also been looking at teaching oracy through talk, because one of the impacts of COVID has been that our young people have reduced the amount of time that they're using speaking formally. And so when they return to school, it's about using those strategies that are necessary in order to engage them, but to get them talking in a way that liberates them, but also uses the right tone, etc. So yes, that's what I've been doing.
Thanks, Camille. Just to bring you in there, Riaz, how does this apply to your school? How does the curriculum design or redesign apply to schools such as yours, which is a faith-based school? Do you have more freedom? I guess I'm saying.
I'd like to think not as much as others. Curriculum is something that we've really invested in for a long time, and it's something that has to change all the time with our demographics. So we represent every area of the world, from the West Indies to the Indian subcontinent to North Africa, to every area of the world, and we've always tried to reflect that in not only our curriculum, which should reflect communities and surrounding communities and emerging communities, but also our staff. Our staff really need to reflect. So that's something we've really invested in. So it's not only about what they learn; it's about what they learn from what they see around the school as well. So to break these systems down, it's not only the content, because it's not only about knowledge and understanding and subjects. It's far deeper than that. If the pandemic has taught us anything, we're all missing human interaction. So learning is far, and schools are far deeper than just content that is being covered by the teacher. So there's so many little things that I could mention, but it's all those little things put together. And I think there was a question earlier in one of the comments, how do we break down and break down the systems that exacerbate disadvantage and the divide, be it digital or through affluency, or most certainly through between BAME and counterparts. It's by doing these little things and patchworking them together and making real change. Without going off topic, I think Robert mentioned something that was really, really interesting to me. He was talking about bias. I know your question was about curriculum, but it really made me think that our schools have always been successful. Now, we have really benefited from our results being successful previously this year in terms of the data that we've then submitted for moderation. That tells me how much are the advantaged and the affluent across the country really benefiting by just continuing to be at the very top. Now, we're an outlier in that we, despite being from a deprived area with what I think is a very broad curriculum, benefited from previous results. But imagine how much that gap is now being just stretched even further because of that bias that those students will always do worse. So that's not answering your question, but going slightly off topic, but I think it connects up. If it's relevant to students, then they will learn, and we've proven that. But it's more than just the curriculum and content. It's far beyond that. It's your systems, processes, absolutely everything. The actual DNA from the school to the day-to-day running.
Thanks, Riaz. Kaushika, people were interested in hearing more about the no detriment policy and how that actually works and is applied for students in higher education. Could you expand a little?
Absolutely. So the no detriment policy is I'll be honest, it's a quite confusing algorithm. And all the universities were asked to consider this, recognizing that when we all went into lockdown, students were preparing, they were finishing their last few weeks of teaching in most universities, and then they were preparing for their assessments. And all the stuff that we've all talked about in terms of access to IT, access to laptops, access to learning, access to tutors, are going to have an impact, and most likely a negative impact on how you can study and how you can achieve. So what we as a university decided that we looked at what others were doing. We looked at the guidance from the Office for Students, and we decided to implement what we called a no detriment policy. And what that means is, at the point at which we finished, at the point at which we went into lockdown, students had a number of marks. They'll have done assessments, they might have done some exams already through the year. We would look at what they had there, and then we would guarantee that no student would achieve below that baseline that they'd achieved at the point we went into lockdown. All the assessments that came after lockdown and the exams that came after lockdown, all of those would add on top what the students would do, so what marks they would get. But you would not get below the baseline at the point at which we went into lockdown. And that's what we mean, that going into lockdown and the way we had to stop or do different teaching and learning, that would not negatively have a bad detriment on your results. So you would continue to do much better if you failed your exams and that took you below, and you failed your exams. We would have a conversation with you, and we would support you in terms of any resets, but you would not be negatively impacted on having to learn and assess differently. That's what the no detriment policy meant. You wouldn't be negatively you wouldn't have a negative impact on your results. Hope that helps.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thanks for clarifying that just a little bit more, Kaushika. I'm conscious that we're coming to the end of towards the end of our time, but before we do that, I just wanted to revisit GCSEs, Robert, and talk about some of the practicalities that parents perhaps can support their children with during this time, or perhaps just give some advice on how students can overcome some of these the inequalities that the predicted grading has presented, if that's okay. In a minute.
Students overcoming the inequalities of predicted grading. In honesty, I'm not quite sure how they can actually overcome that, other than them having that sense of self-belief, and that really comes from not only them as an individual, but the family support and the support of those other people around them who are of influence. Because what really happens is that, as I said before, people very often take on board the perception that other people have of them and use that as a force to prevent them from progressing. And really, in that respect, they need to have that sense of self-belief. But it's a wider concept whereby they need help from other people. They need help from the community. And And we have many great things going on, and at the African Caribbean Centre, again, where they're trying to get this point across of students being able to have access to work outside of school. So it's an extracurricular thing, but it takes a lot of self-governance, self-discipline in order to continue to do that outside of normal schooling. And that's really the thing. The way things can be helped at home is very difficult. Parents are very often disengaged from education. If they're disengaged, then it's more difficult for them to continue to push their children to stay on track with education. So it requires that family support at home, which is very often a difficult thing to tap into. But where it is there, it's really a case of it's an alien situation for all of us, teaching our children at home on a daily basis. But it's really embracing that and guiding the students through that process as well. So it's the community, which is one aspect, and it's also the parental and home help that's really going to push them and help them to succeed.
Thanks, Robert. And I'll just open this final question up to anybody who feels that they might have a particular viewpoint on this. But with the rest of the country coming out of lockdown, and we've seen in the news even today that there's a possibility that Leicester may go into lockdown, and that you represent schools that are in one of the highest areas, North Evington area, which apparently has the highest cases of coronavirus. How are you shifting plans for a return to school in the next few months? Does anybody want to venture into that area?
I don't mind answering that.
Okay.
Yeah, we encroach North Evington. Many of our students, whilst they come from across the city, a large proportion come from North Evington, so it is a concern. We've been out of sync with most schools nationally and locally anyway in not bringing students back, and I think our mantra will continue the exact the same. If it's safe to do so, we will return. If it's not, we won't. I know there's pressure nationally, but I think the basic metrics of the statistical impact on the BAME community, not necessarily from government guidance, but from most certainly medical guidance, the Independent SAGE report, Royal Society of Psychiatrists, and every health or medical related body seems to have a consensus that the increased impact and effect on our associated communities. So plans are changing almost daily. Getting tired of changing the plans, but we're taking every day as it comes, and I'm sure every head teacher and every teacher is. But first thing has to be keeping our students and our staff safe. So that's the only consideration. I think learning comes after that.
Thank you, Riaz. Well, we have come to the end of our session, our webinar. It's certainly been enlightening. I would like to thank all of our panelists today. You have provided some really enriching content, some conversation that I'm sure outside of this webinar will continue with staff, with students, local educators. Thank you very much for your insights. For everybody who joined us today, we will be sharing more information about some of the things that we touched on today, such as the no detriment policy, decolonizing DMU. We have a dedicated website for that. So we will share that information. Go to the SLRC website, which is on the main DMU website, to find out more. In the next couple of weeks or so, sooner hopefully rather than later, we will be announcing our new resource platform, the COVID files. We've been collecting information on how Corona has affected many of the aspects that we are dealing with in society, from education, reports, government guidance, all of that sort of stuff. So that will be a dedicated resource for academics, students, parents, anybody interested in finding out a little bit more or tracking conversations around coronavirus and the BAME community. If you want to keep in touch with us, do join our mailing list. I'm sure the link has been already shared in the chat. You can also watch this webinar again. It will be on our website immediately following this. It'll be available on YouTube and Facebook. And finally, I'd just like to say that we will be doing some more webinars in the series. The Exchange is an ongoing platform for these conversations. If you are interested in perhaps using the Exchange as a forum to share some of your ideas, do get in touch with us. And please do complete the evaluation form at the end of this webinar. Thanks again, everybody, for joining, and thank you to our panelists. Have a great evening, everyone.